across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View. So grateful you could join us. And even though the 4th of July is in the background, looking out the rearview mirror, we're seeing it pass by. I thought it would still be appropriate this week to focus a little bit of time and attention on some things that we can learn from the 4th of July. That is my first article that comes from Congressman Andy Biggs. Second hour today, we're going to spend some time with our good friend Jerry Newcombe. He has a book that is actually an abridged edition of an earlier book called Doubting Thomas. This one's called Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty, because as we have pointed out before, Thomas Jefferson probably could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church. Okay, we know that. And in many ways, he really did accept some of the ideas of Unitarianism and deism and theism, things of that nature, not necessarily an Orthodox Christian. But at one time, he was much closer to that. And I think we will learn that sometimes historians, when they pick and choose particular quotes from a particular era, don't necessarily honestly represent individuals. And so that's kind of our story next hour, which we will get into. Very similar to the book that we did a while back with Peter Lowbeck on Sacred Fire. I pointed out and I held up that copy. Maybe I'll do that again just for the fun of it, how thick that first book was. And then they've given us an abridged edition. The good news is both this one on George Washington, this one on Thomas Jefferson, really good books and much more readable. And so I thought we would spend some time there. But of course, we'll get back into issues in the news. I've got a piece by Don Federer, who's been a columnist, has been on the program with us as well. Another piece dealing with what's going on right now in the Democratic Party. Yes, I'll probably say something about what is happening right now with, of course, Grant Plattner up there in Maine, and also a few other things that have been able to focus on today. I've already put together some of the articles for tomorrow. It's going to be a good program as well. So each day I hope you can join us as we get into some of these issues. But Congressman Andy Biggs talks about the heroes who made the 4th of July possible. And when I first started reading, I thought, I wonder which ones he's going to pick. I would have picked some different ones or additional ones, because I think the ones he's picked are very good. But it's just a reminder of that. But he starts out by reminding us that this 4th of July has been a special time. And tomorrow I will talk about how the mainstream press just could not get into the 4th of July and complained about everything from the smoke from the fireworks to some of the things that were on the National Mall. So we'll get into some of that tomorrow, but let's start with the positive. And that is, he said, again, 250 years ago on July 4th, marked by festivities today, we're talking about the fact that even back then, when it was ratified July 2nd and it was announced July 4th, it was mired, as he said, in a time of uncertainty, sacrifice, fear, and desperation. If you've read any of the books or even seen some of the videos lately coming out about the American Revolution, you realize how this victory that eventually arrived at Yorktown was about as uncertain as anything you can possibly imagine, and how those people who signed their names to the Declaration of Independence knew full well that even if they didn't lose their lives, and many would have, they certainly would have lost their homes, and many did even in that process. And so he points out that Americans are a blessed people, and we certainly are coveted by people around the globe, as illustrated by, the U.S. soccer team lost yesterday. Pretty sure that was going to happen because Belgium is a much better team in many ways. But nevertheless, just the fact is we have had so many people from all sorts of countries around the world, Europe, Africa, South America, Asia, and they've all really loved America. And so it is a reminder that we sometimes take all of that for granted. So he points out that maybe we would benefit from remembering some of the stories of the American Revolution. And so he picks three. The first one is one that many people have used as their illustration. George Washington used it himself. I mentioned Michael Medved the other day as well. He mentions it. I'm thinking of, just a handful of other people that have talked about this, and that is George Washington crossing the Delaware River for a Christmas attack on the Hessians, which were those who were hired by the British, German Hessians, and he led these men who were weary and unfit to fight against the greatest army in the world at the time. He knew that this surprise attack had a high chance of failure, not the least of which could you even cross the Delaware River at that time with the ice there, and yet that success, without a doubt, marks the turning point in the war. Matter of fact, the classic book 1776 pretty much ends with that story by this eminent historian as well, pointing out how close we came to it ending in the last few days of 1776. The victory, small though it was enough to keep individuals from retiring or going home, deserting, whatever it might have happened, and so that is one. The second one he picked, which is the story of Caesar Rodney. Now, for those of you that have quarters, if you look on the back of some of the quarters, each one of the quarters, if you might remember, at the time, had a story of somebody from a particular state. So if you had a quarter that was talking about Delaware, you have the picture of Caesar Rodney. He was a delegate from Delaware to the Continental Congress. He was a marked man, first because he was a marked man by the British, but he also had cancer, which had ravaged his body. And yet he was not there for the initial voting for independence. But when it came time for the vote, he was able to summon his courage, though very sick, traveled 80 miles, exposed to all sorts of elements to actually cast that vote. And I thought that was a great illustration as well. His third, of course, is of Robert Morris. Morris, perhaps one of the more forgotten men, he says, of the Revolution. And yet he opposed the war, but decided to fight for independence. And as a result, he and many others, of course, gave so much in terms of losing all of their benefits and all of their financial stability. And so Andy Biggs asks a good question. What if Washington had not decided to cross the Delaware, or if that had been a failure? What if Caesar Rodney had not made his ride? What if Robert Morris had not come around to actually support independence, and decided that maybe having his life as a loyalist would probably have been better than as a patriot? We may not have had America that we celebrate today. So it's just a great little piece, 3 pages long, easy to read, something you might want to read around the dinner table tonight to your children, your grandchildren, the heroes who made July 4th possible. I could mention many others. The battle at Saratoga certainly comes to mind. The moving of the cannons from Canada all the way down to Boston, and of course Yorktown, and all sorts of other things that happened there. Just an incredible number of stories. And perhaps we might even be able to get Eric Metaxas on. His book on the American Revolution would be one that we could cover. But I thought just for a few minutes, as we're getting into the spirit of America, we will, in the next hour, spend some time talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe about Thomas Jefferson, a man that in some respects gave us the Declaration of Independence, and in many cases was willing to allow these other less intelligent people to edit it into the form that we have today. We'll talk about that next hour, but let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many Americans, including my children, have been involved in what is called app-based gig work. John Stossel, in his latest video, says that this would include jobs like Rover, DoorDash food delivery, Uber, and Lyft driving. Unfortunately, progressive activists argue that gig workers aren't always getting minimum wage and complain that they rarely join unions. Seattle City Council has a solution: impose a $26 delivery driver minimum wage. Stossel reports that gig workers made no more money, but prices went up. Apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats added an additional fee for consumers to help cover the cost of these regulations. Now Seattle residents complain about the prices. One resident complained, "I ordered a $12 sandwich, which grew to $32. On the video, she admitted, "I just deleted the app." He interviewed an economics professor who explained, when you're increasing cost to businesses, you're going to increase cost to customers. These are complicated markets. You must evaluate the cost of restaurants, delivery workers, and customers. The newly elected socialist mayor and the progressive city council cannot factor all those costs, but that doesn't keep them from trying. John Stossel interviewed a former Seattle City Council president who admitted this was a mistake, but wasn't ready to repeal the harmful law. She confidently said that she needed to adjust their numbers. A free market and competition are a better way to decide what people get paid. His video reminded us of the warning economist Friedrich Hayek gave in the book The Road to Serfdom about politicians and bureaucrats. The road is paved with good intentions, but they make the economic problems worse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Next, we're going to spend some time talking about Thomas Jefferson, so of course you'll learn some of his history, but let's for just a minute come to a very good piece by Don Feder. He has been a columnist that used to write for papers in Boston. I think this one actually came from one that was in the Washington Times, so he's certainly an individual we've had on the program many times, and he does a contrast between, and I'll hold up the Declaration of Independence. There is a copy that we have made of not only the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which we still make available, and, of course, the Communist Manifesto. And I'll hold up some of our booklets on socialism and capitalism and the rest. And it does seem to me that when we get into this, we, as he says, have a choice to make. He says we have a choice between two conflicting worldviews, one of freedom and dignity, the other of regimented society based on submission to the ideology of the ruling elite. And that is not hyperbole. It is, I think, very well documented. I'll pull up my booklet here on socialism, for example, and point out that we do have a history of what this looks like. First, of course, the Soviet Union decided to have a socialist experiment. Then we had lots of countries in Europe, Poland, Yugoslavia, Albania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. Add to that countries in Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, North Korea, and China. And then we have countries in South America, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela. And, of course, we have other countries in Africa, Angola, Ghana, Tanzania, Benin, Mali, and Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. If you use his count, and I think it's actually low, he comes up with 25 failed experiments in capitalism, or in communism and socialism. These are countries that did not want to consider capitalism, and we, of course, have a very sad history of what that looks like. So he points out that, again, one of these, the Declaration of Independence, liberates. The other, the Communist Manifesto, in slaves. One points the way towards a new dawn for humanity, other towards a dark night of collectivism. And he says these visions were set forth in two of the most important documents in history, written 72 years apart. Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776, Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. He says the struggle which is going on around us is a manifestation, he says, of these two mutually exclusive worldviews. The Declaration, he points out, reflected the thinking of the most brilliant minds ever assembled in one place. These are merchants and planters and lawyers and inventors, a physician, many in the clergy that signed it. One that in particular signed it, of course, Witherspoon. And the Communist Manifesto, written, of course, by Karl Marx, who he points out was quite a failure. And if you've ever read the book, The Intellectuals, or I've even done a week of radio programs based on the book Intellectuals, you can go to probe.org and find that, you realize this story of whether it was, Karl Marx, whether it was Friedrich Nietzsche, whether it was George Hegel, you realize Voltaire, Rousseau. I mean, many of these individuals were really very sad individuals, but their works continue on, and a new generation doesn't know their story, thinks that that was very good. And he called for the abolition of capitalism, he points out, without ever setting foot on a factory floor. Well, the Declaration of Independence, 1,300 words, and, of course, the Communist Manifesto, about 12,000 words. I was going to hold up a copy of that, but I can't seem to find mine, and maybe I need to buy another one just to have it there. But nevertheless, it was actually a summary of something that I read an abridged version of in graduate school, Das Kapital, which is actually 2,500 pages. Like Mein Kampf, it's best used as a doorstop. But the point he's making is that you really have a choice. And when we come back from the break, I do want to get into a very good piece by Matt Margulies about the Socialist Democratic Party and how, in some respects, you're wondering why, especially if you can maybe consider the elder statesman of the Democratic Party, that'd be Barack Obama, has said very little about the direction in which the party is going. This is of concern, and he goes into some detail in that regard. But here, if nothing else, the point that Don Feder is making is that the vision that the founders had actually was able to take America from a colonial backwater to a nation that has very significantly dominated the 20th century and now even the 21st century. The economic benefit that came from that, which gave us the light bulb, the airplane, the telephone, the television, the refrigerator, the microchip, and the internet, all prosperity lifted all the boats, and that is certainly the case. By contrast, as I just pointed out a minute ago, the record of communism is very dismal indeed. Drenched, as he points out, in blood and reeks of human suffering. Since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1970, communism has been responsible for anywhere from 65 million to probably the better accurate number, 100 million deaths worldwide. And of course, Marxism-Leninism has, of course, enriched our vocabulary, he says, with phrases like gulags, killing fields, plan, famines, death camps, and even purges. And the problem that we are facing today is a younger generation not having grown up during the Cold War, not having seen the difference between East Germany and West Germany, although they could certainly see the difference between North Korea and South Korea, nevertheless thinks that democratic socialism is the answer. And it is making inroads. He points out that our largest city and America's financial hub has a Marxist mayor. Our capital city, the District of Columbia, will soon have one as well. Marxists just won Democratic primaries in 2 congressional seats in New York, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Colorado. One of the winners in New York wants to abolish private property, wants to abolish borders, wants to abolish prisons, and even led a pro-Hamas occupation. And he says, in a sense, right now, history for many decades now and even centuries has come down to a life and death struggle between the two. But he says right now we're in sort of a life and death struggle between Americanism and communism. Communism is monolithic. Americanism is individualistic. Americanism says our rights come from God. Under communism, rights come from the state. And so he says Americanism embraces human nature. Communism fights it at every turn, attempting to pound square pegs into round holes, which is why it fails every time. He says Americanism welcomes debate. Communism tries to crush it. And so, if nothing else, he gives us some of the contrast, but he ends with an interesting fantasy that he has had. And it's a fantasy that I've had not so much about Karl Marx as I have about Charles Darwin. But his fantasy is this. His fantasy is, imagine if there was some way you could bring Karl Marx back to life. In it, the prophet of communism looks at the world his ideology created. He looks at the lights in the night sky in South Korea and the darkness in North Korea. He compares the repression in communist China with the freedom in Taiwan. He surveys the rubble of what was once the Berlin Wall. He looks at the suffering in Cuba. He compares the gross domestic product of the United States to Russia. And after he digests all of this, the father of communism says to himself, man, what was I thinking? As I pointed out before in many of our booklets dealing with socialism, Karl Marx was living in a time in which the Industrial Revolution certainly had some very significant social cost. And as he looked around, he said, this is not good. We have people that are unemployed. We have people working too many hours. We have too much pollution. And so certainly we need to begin to address these issues, some of which came from the Industrial Revolution in England. Some of them just came from his utopian vision that eventually we can come to a world where people will no longer be greedy, will no longer need private property, each will produce according to their ability, and each will receive according to their needs. But then the reality has hit. And we know what communism and socialism brings. And I think it's just a very good piece. Don Federer, not to be confused with William Federer. They have similar last names, but Don Federer, columnist, I think has done a good job of talking about the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Communist Manifesto, the difference between Americanism and communism, and a battle that I suspect we'll be fighting for some time, even in these midterm elections. Let's take a break, come back with more right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's we can talk about this idea of democratic socialism for a little while and how that is starting to have an impact on the Democratic Party. Now, I was speaking just the other day in a church and offered this little booklet on socialism, and then this one, Road to Serfdom, which actually has a picture of the Democratic Socialist Party on the front, and we ran out. As a matter of fact, I need to bring back some more copies of Democratic Socialism one, and even a few more of the ones on socialism. So this is becoming a popular topic. It is something we have been talking about for some time here on Point of View. You can bet and you can estimate that we're going to be talking about it a lot more given what has been happening in these midterms. But I have a very good article that comes out from Mark Margolis about the Socialist Democratic Party is Obama's legacy. Now, he goes a little further than I do, and I sometimes give you articles that I don't 100% agree with because I want you to see kind of the range of ideas. But his argument is that actually, even though when he was president, even when he was candidate, but certainly when he was president for 8 years, President Barack Obama said a lot of things that would be contradictory to the platform of the Democratic Socialist. For example, he has in many cases defended the idea of free markets. Back in 2013, he said free markets are something we have to endorse. Nobody questions the efficacy of market economies in terms of producing wealth and innovation and keeping us competitive. He is known as an individual that has, and this is the story, this is where Mark Margolis doesn't always buy this, that during, you might remember the 2012 Democratic Convention, there was a big issue about whether or not Israel could even be in the platform. We were starting to see the beginnings of anti-Semitism. And so I'll give you what Matt says. I don't necessarily buy it, but that's okay. I'm trying to give you perspective. He said during the 2012 Democratic National Convention, the narrative was that Barack Obama personally stepped in to resolve the issue of a party platform removing the recognition of Israel. He said, I never believed the official story, but even if it's true, to keep up appearances, that was the official story. Today, anti-Semitism has become, and we can all agree on this, almost mainstream in the Democratic Party as socialist candidates are slowly taking that over. And if you look at some of the various candidates, and I'll mention a few of them in passing as we go through this, you can see where that is the case. So Matt Margolis asks, well, where is Barack Obama now? He's silent on many issues related to his party's radical shift to the left. Now, he, in order to make his case, quotes somebody else who we've interviewed on this program a few times before, and that is Larry Elder. By the way, our listeners in California know who Larry Elder is, not only a talk show host, but an individual ran for governor. And he has, again, pointed out that Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, has spent years positioning himself, and this is his phrase, the moral compass of his own party, but he's been quiet unless the stakes demand otherwise. And so the question that Mark Margolis is asking is, if you accept that, I think that's a fair assessment, where is former President Barack Obama now? Because as we pointed out in 2013, he was very supportive of free markets. And yet here, instead, you have the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, and I'm going to give you a number of articles tomorrow, which will go into some detail. This almost 4th of July rant from the mayor of New York City. We'll get into it. I've got two pieces from two different individuals on that particular issue, but Zohran Mamdani, the mayor Mamdani, wants to tear up the framework of free market, has vowed to replace the fragility, I guess is what he said, of rugged individualism with a warmth of collectivism. You might remember that. And then, of course, Zohran Mamdani, Mayor Mamdani, has endorsed Daraliza Avila Chevalier, who is, of course, an individual who has defended communism. and is one that maybe is now trying to look a little bit more moderate, but we do have all the things she's said over the years. You have Claire Valdez, another individual that has been endorsed by Mayor Mamdani, who supports nationwide rent control. And these are individuals that are linked to the Democratic Socialist of America. And we need to have Dr. Merrill Matthews write another piece on that. He was actually one that summarized the most recent Democratic Socialist of America convention. But they have, for example, backed what's called Boycott, Disinvestment, and Sanctions, BDS, which you've heard of before, and have called Israel an apartheid state. Well, even this is beyond even what Barack Obama would allow, because his former Secretary of State, at least under Joe Biden, and his former assistant under Barack Obama, get it right there, called this idea of genocide meritless. Barack Obama never used the word. Matter of fact, he defended the right of Israel to defend itself after the attack by Hamas on October 7th. So you can see, whether you look at private property, the free market, Israel, anti-Semitism, on almost every issue that is being promoted now by these Democratic Socialist candidates in the Democratic Party, former President Barack Obama is on the opposite side. And so, again, Barack Obama, as he points out, used to even laugh off some people referring to him as socialist. He once told critics that they should meet real socialists, and spent years warning against extremes on both sides. So, again, this is where Matt Margolis says, well, why isn't he saying anything? And he says, from where I sit, maybe the party is going the direction he wanted to. Because if you think about this, in 2009, his economic stimulus was one of the largest government interventions in the market economy that you can imagine. Don't forget that, of course, later on, when we were talking about what is oftentimes referred to the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, that was probably the largest intervention into the market that we've ever had before. And so, on the one hand, he says President Barack Obama's public rhetoric stayed friendly to markets and capitalism. His policy record, though, tells a different story, one of steady government expansion into healthcare, into lending, and into the broader economy. And at the same time, he might just be saying, well, maybe Zohran Mamdani, Avila Chevalier, and even Valdez are simply the next chapter in my legacy. He built an environment that made it possible. Maybe that's why he's remaining silent. I think it is interesting, if nothing else, to notice that some of the people that were in the Obama administration are starting to speak out, even if former President Barack Obama is not, because they recognize the dangers of some of these ideas and are really speaking out. And one other rather interesting illustration of that has happened with Graham Plattner. Now, for those of you that live in Maine, you know the story. I think because it's become a national story, most do. Graham Plattner has, can we put it in a nice way, a rather checkered history sexually. And Matt Vesta says, well, what took it so long? You know, we had a, if you will, Republican woman, Lindsay Fifield, I think is how she pronounces her last name, talking about all these allegations against Graham Plattner, who, by the way, is the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Maine. And now that you have Jenny Ransicott, who was the other day interviewed on CNN, now all of a sudden this is a much bigger issue. Whereas before, when Lindsay Fifield came out with those, the New York Times did uncover some sexual assault allegations, but they didn't really bother to verify the claims, even though they had certainly enough time and effort to do so. But now that you have a woman that is a liberal Democrat who would certainly like the Democrats to win, she's one of them. She wants a Democrat to beat Senator Susan Collins and supports some of his agenda, but she wants to give the voters the complete and full picture. So she received a lengthy interview with CNN's Jake Tapper the other night, and many people are now calling this the election-killing story for Graham Plattner. I think there's another explanation, and that is, I think the Democratic leadership said, this man is toxic. We only have a few days left before we can switch his name out and put somebody else in there. And if we don't do it soon, our chances of beating Susan Collins are slim and really none. And so I think some of this was the word went out. It's time to interview somebody who can maybe end this candidacy and see if we can come up with a better challenger to Senator Susan Collins. So maybe the Democratic leadership recognizes that some of these issues and some of these candidates are not winning candidates and issues, and maybe we'll hear more later on. We'll take a break, come back with some more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, one of the things I say probably too often is the fact that we have spent millions and millions, probably billions of dollars doing studies to basically document what we already know. But this is one of those studies that come from the Federal Reserve, and after all, it is your money, and in some respects, not necessarily your tax dollars per se, but your money in one way or another flows to the Federal Reserve because you probably have banking. The Federal Reserve has a working paper in which they found, and again, this is not real surprising, that this record surge in illegal immigration triggered higher home prices and higher rents. I think we already sort of knew that. But nevertheless, it's good to know that some people actually took the time to dig this out. Now, again, you can go to our website here and read this if you'd like, because maybe you're going to get involved in some conversation about immigration or deportation or whatever. And this is something that you can find very easily. We have it entitled The Cost of Illegal Immigration. And I pulled this one, Fox Business. I found a number of other places. You can go to the original. Matter of fact, we have a link to the original Federal Reserve article, but it's almost impenetrable. They use so many academic words. I think this nice one-page summary from Fox Business is good enough. But if you want to find the original paper so that somebody said, well, that's just on Fox News. Yeah, well, they just, I think, did a better job of covering the story and making it readable. But you can go back with the link to the original story that was done, by the way, by the Federal Reserve Bank right here in Dallas is where this came from. Now, again, I won't go into a lot of detail, but the paper combines immigration court records with government administrative data to measure how this, if you will, unprecedented wave of illegal immigration from 2021 to 2024, primarily during the Biden administration specifically, how that affected labor markets and housing markets. Now, here's the interesting thing. They found that if you had an increase, even of 1% of unauthorized workers, we would call those illegal workers or migrants or whatever phrase you want to use, but they use the term unauthorized workers, correspond with roughly about 1% increase in overall employment, but not much in terms of changing wages. Which is interesting because one of the arguments is when you bring in a lot of people from other countries, sometimes you lower the wages. This particular paper doesn't show that. Okay, I appreciate them being honest about that. Howsoever, when you have that same 1% increase and associated with a virtually 2 to 2.2% rise in home prices and 1.4% increase in rents. So the bottom line is when you have more people coming in, I, by the way, would acknowledge that maybe it didn't have an impact in wages at the moment, but long term, I could see how that it would. But it has almost an instantaneous impact on house prices and rent and that's because you have more people looking for places to stay. So if nothing else, that I think is kind of intriguing. And of course, they're probably, if they're going to be biased at all, probably are not going to try to say anything that would seem to be anti-immigrant, since they want to have as many workers as possible. So I think there'll be some other studies will come out and maybe document even the impact that could have had on wages. But I think the impact on wages would be more long-term than short-term. But the impact on housing, well, just what you guessed is the case. Economists estimate the unauthorized immigrant workforce I love how they try to find the most neutral terms possible, which is fine. Account for about 30% of employment growth, roughly 30% of home price growth, and about 20% of rent growth in average metropolitan areas. And they go from March 2021 to March 2024. Now, if you want to read the rest of it, you can do so, but I just think it illustrates a point that we've made before. That is, you can't bring in all these people or allow all these people to come in and not have an impact. We could, of course, talk about the impact that it has on social services, the number of people that are going to emergency rooms, the number of children going to the schools, on and on and on. We have for some time talked about some of that, but this is the latest paper, and it illustrates something that really is not a big surprise. That is, you bring more people in, and there are only a certain number of houses, certain number of apartments, prices are going to go up. And that's exactly what took place. Well, just before we take a break, though, and we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend, Dr. Jerry Newcombe, about Thomas Jefferson. Let me also mention my commentary today. And as you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can see the show materials, all four of those that I quoted there. Scroll down, and you'll see my Viewpoints commentary. And my Viewpoints commentary today has to do with the fact that, again, many of these democratic socialists are wanting to affect the economy. And one place where you see that is what is oftentimes referred to as gig work or gig workers. And this is, again, from a very good piece, which you can find if you go to the website by watching the video of John Stossel, in which we have seen, and he focuses most of his time and attention on Seattle, although we also have some of it happening in New York City. And that is the people in the Seattle City Council, Democratic Socialist, and now we have a mayor who's a Democratic Socialist. We're concerned that these gig workers, first of all, don't always join unions, and that's not good. And also, some of them, they were afraid weren't getting minimum wage. So the Seattle City Council implemented a $26 delivery driver minimum wage. And as a result, what happens is that these apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats, they had to, in order to make this work, have additional fee for consumers to help cover the cost of regulations. I quote one Seattle resident who said, "I ordered a $12 sandwich, which grew to $32. First of all, can you imagine a $12 sandwich? Okay. And as I said, I just deleted the app. And of course, we then see an interview that John Stossel does with an economics professor, points out the obvious. When you're trying to increase costs to businesses, you're going to increase the cost to consumers. These are very complicated markets. You have to evaluate the cost to the restaurants, to the delivery drivers, and to the customers. So you would think, okay, this didn't work out so well. We are, in some respects, destroying some of these gig workers and these app-based gig work apps. And so, I know, maybe they'll repeal the harmful law. Oh, no. Interviews a former Seattle City Council president who admitted maybe it's time to adjust the numbers, but we're not going to get rid of that. And it just reminded me of course, one of the things I've been holding up a couple of times, which is based upon this very good book that came out many years ago by Friedrich Hayek on the road to serfdom, because as he points out, the road to serfdom is oftentimes paved with good intentions. And in many cases, what these policies do is make an economic set of circumstances worse. And we see that in Seattle. Of course, John Stossel also talks about what's going on in New York City. And if this continues for any length of time, we're going to have lots and lots of examples we'll be talking about here on Point of View. So anybody that thinks that democratic socialism is a solution has not paid attention to basic economics, and certainly not paid attention to some of the things we've tried talking about here on Point of View. But let's take a break and come back. A little bit of history. What about Thomas Jefferson? He has been oftentimes identified as kind of a secular deist. Not saying that he's a Christian, but I think he was a lot more favorable to Christianity than most historians give him credit for. And you'll find that out in our interview, which we'll have right after these important messages.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about Thomas Jefferson because of this new book, Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty. And it is, again, if you will, an addition to and an updating to the previous book that they have written called Doubting Thomas. And Dr. Jerry Newcombe is one of the authors. He's the executive director of the Providence Forum, also senior producer and on-air host for Truths That Transform, co-author or author of 33 books, 17 written with Dr. D. James Kennedy, one with Dr. Peter Lillback. And you might remember, hold this one up, Peter Lillback was on the program with us recently. We've talked about in the past his book, Sacred Fire. Well, this one is an abridged edition. I don't necessarily strain my muscles having to lift this one in the air to illustrate that. And in some respects, these new ones that have come out in the 250th anniversary of Americans' independence are really good because not only do you have now the information that was in the original Doubting Thomas, but many of the years of the correspondence and papers of Jefferson were not available back when they published that book back in 2015. So, Dr. Jerry Newcombe, it is always a delight to have you on the program, and we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson today, aren't we?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Kerby. Good to be with you.
Let's give the history because you have, again, co-authored some of these books. We talked about you nicely the other day when we talked about the book George Washington's Sacred Fire, and I do like the abridged edition and appreciate that. But this one is similar but different than Doubting Thomas because, as I pointed out a minute ago, I think it was Princeton University Press had published all but some of the years of Thomas Jefferson's papers and memorandum. So even if somebody has on their shelf, as many of us do, the book Doubting Thomas, this new book on Thomas Jefferson brings you up to date, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And the summary of both books is really two main points. Number one, Jefferson, who was very important to the American cause, was not a lifelong skeptic. Early on, when he was most helpful to the American cause, he was, from all outward appearances, a professing, believing Christian. And then point number two, he certainly didn't believe, even in his most liberal stages or whatever, later in life, in the separation of God and government. He did not believe that, we're established as a secular country. In fact, he's the one who wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from the Creator. And that's the essence of America, is really the 2 points in the Declaration of Independence, that the Creator is the one who's given us our rights. He's made us, we have our rights from Him, number one. And number two, we are governed by the consent of the governed. So self-rule under God, it's the essence of the American experiment. And you could see it in the Declaration of Independence. You could see it in the Constitution, and you could see it in the 100 or so charters and so forth, like the Mayflower Compact before it, about 150 years before it, where basically, to use the words of Os Guinness, the biblical concept of covenant gave rise to the American Constitution. And so anyway, and the Constitution, of course, is predicated on the Declaration of Independence, which mentions God 4 times. And yeah.
Well, I was just going to mention that you have 7 chapters dealing with 6 chapters dealing with Thomas Jefferson, then a 7th chapter on Christian nationalism, an 8th chapter on secular deism, and some conclusions. But that's a good point, because one of the things that you and your co-author point out is that if you are, for example, a secular historian, oftentimes they will mix a few quotes from Jefferson's early years, but mostly focus on his later years when he was much more skeptical. And then sometimes Christians have maybe only focused on those early years, and there really is, I think, almost 2 Thomas Jeffersons in terms of how he views religion. Is that fair?
I think that'd be very fair. But even in the most secular, even in the most anti-Christian part of his legacy, you don't have the ACLU's Thomas Jefferson. In other words, you don't have the idea that, you can't have any reference to God or something in government, and he was sworn in on the Holy Bible. He said, "So help me God." He mentioned God in his inaugural addresses. At least I know he did in the first one. I don't remember the second one offhand, but he mentions God a lot. I think this is really important, because in his name, they've tried to banish any kind of reference to God, especially any kind of Christian reference, and that's even wrong. So, for example, the phrase "the separation of church and state," which entered into American jurisprudence through the U.S. Supreme Court in a 1947 decision, and they said, "Oh, look at this obscure." Well, they didn't say it was obscure, but look at this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association. Okay, and he said that our founding fathers said Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So he's beginning with the quote of the First Amendment, the beginning of the First Amendment, and he says, thus erecting a wall of separation between church and state. So the Supreme Court said, this is what the founders meant when they said Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Historically, it was understood, well, there's going to be no Church of America like there was a Church of England. That's what the Establishment Clause meant. And in the meantime, no prohibition of, religious freedom. Okay. And in his name, they started to, say, oh, you can't have school prayer. Oh, you can't have the Bible at school. Oh, actually they said Bible reading as devotional. But later that kind of translated in many schools to mean, no, you can't have the Bible, period, in the public schools. And it just went on from there. Ironically, the very letter that mentions the separation of church and state, that is the source of that phrase, and it violates the ACLU's version of the separation of church and state, because at the end of the letter he says, I want you devout Baptists in Connecticut, I want you to pray for me to God, and I'm going to pray to God for you. And I will benefit from that. But that violates the separation of church and state as they understand it. And so, we've come to this place where, the America has been remade in a very secular image in the name of Thomas Jefferson in ways that are totally distorting what he himself said.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, maybe you can give us some of the background in his early years, because he was a vestryman, that is part of lay leadership of the church. I know that he had a resolution really designating a day of fasting and prayer, founder of a Calvinistic church. Doesn't sound exactly like a deist to me, and of course we can get into some of those issues. Then we'll talk about a little bit later, as he maybe had some questions about religious separation and the rest. And then, of course, was he, as the subtitles say, a Christian nationalist or a secular deist? That is a whole section in the book there as well. And, of course, even has some appendices that have two of these sermons by Reverend Charles Clay, even on the reliability of scripture sources and the rest. So we're going to learn a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson. I can't think of a better person to talk to than Jerry Newcombe. By the way, of course, he was also very much involved in George Washington's Sacred Fire. So two good books that I would recommend, and we have information about that on our website. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many Americans, including my children, have been involved in what is called app-based gig work. John Stossel, in his latest video, says that this would include jobs like Rover, DoorDash food delivery, Uber, and Lyft driving. Unfortunately, progressive activists argue that gig workers aren't always getting minimum wage and complain that they rarely join unions. Seattle City Council has a solution: impose a $26 delivery driver minimum wage. Stossel reports that gig workers made no more money, but prices went up. Apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats added an additional fee for consumers to help cover the cost of these regulations. Now Seattle residents complain about the prices. One resident complained, "I ordered a $12 sandwich, which grew to $32. On the video, she admitted, "I just deleted the app." He interviewed an economics professor who explained, when you're increasing cost to businesses, you're going to increase cost to customers. These are complicated markets. You must evaluate the cost of restaurants, delivery workers, and customers. The newly elected socialist mayor and the progressive city council cannot factor all those costs, but that doesn't keep them from trying. John Stossel interviewed a former Seattle City Council president who admitted this was a mistake, but wasn't ready to repeal the harmful law. She confidently said that she needed to adjust their numbers. A free market and competition are a better way to decide what people get paid. His video reminded us of the warning economist Friedrich Hayek gave in the book The Road to Serfdom about politicians and bureaucrats. The road is paved with good intentions, but they make the economic problems worse. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jerry Newcombe with us as we are talking about the book that he has co-authored on the subject of Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty. It is a book that you perhaps can find in your local bookstore, but again, we certainly have information about that on our newly revised pointofview.net website, and you can scroll down and see that information there, learn more about it, share it with others, and the rest. And Jerry, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about the early early years of Thomas Jefferson, because, again, you and your co-author, very fair, in which you point out that, okay, he had some real questions about some of the basic doctrines of the Christian faith, but he spent about half his time with ministers and pastors that were maybe Unitarian, about half his time with those that were Orthodox. But if you look at some of the actions that he did, especially in his early years, my goodness, I mean, he was very supportive of the church in a variety of different ways, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Thomas Jefferson was a vestryman, as you mentioned, in the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Church, which was established, by the way, in Virginia. And by doing that, by becoming a vestryman, that meant he had to swear that he believed in all the doctrines of the church. Even later in life, when he harbored some private doubts about the Trinity, that would be probably the single most important doctrine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge one, and I disagree with him. But anyway, bottom line is that when he was young, he believed or professed to believe in the doctrines, and he was governor of Virginia in 1774 when the conflicts, especially between England and Boston. Samuel Adams is the grandfather of America, and if you look at all the history of the whole thing, Samuel Adams, the lightning rod of the American Revolution, because of the Boston Tea Party, which occurred in 1773. The communications between England and America were very slow back then. England decided to punish Boston because of the Boston Tea Party. So come June 1, 1774, they closed the port, and they had all these British ships of war there in the Boston harbor. And the British expected they would just isolate and punish Boston alone. They didn't expect the rest of the colonies to respond and work together. And Samuel Adams, with his committees of correspondence, was communicating to patriots all around the country, and so forth. So you had in Virginia, Governor, Mr. Jefferson wrote up. I don't think he was governor then at that moment, but anyway, he wrote up basically a fasting day, a prayer proclamation.
Yes.
And, they're calling on the Lord, basically saying, God, we need your help. George Washington wrote in his diary on June 1, fasted all day, went to church. That was George Washington did that on June 1, 1774. When they finally met for the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774, Samuel Adams was there, and people the day before they met, they said, should we open in prayer, yes or no? And Samuel Adams said, absolutely. I'm no bigot. I can listen to a man who loves his God and loves his country, regardless of his Christian denomination. I mean, that's what it really boiled down to, as to whether they should open in prayer or not. The Catholics were there. There were some Quakers there, some Presbyterians, Anglicans. They prayed in different ways. No problem. Let's hear it, as long as it's, loving God and loving the country. And so they did. So anyway, but going back to Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, that was, of course, in the summer of 1776, and he mentions God 4 times. The document does. 4 times it mentions God. Above all, says that our rights come from God. Within a year, February of 1777, Thomas Jefferson, as a layman, because the Anglican Church no longer existed in Charlottesville, he, as a layman, co-founded an evangelical church. They called the Reverend Charles Clay, who was a rarity because he was ordained as an Anglican, he was an evangelical, and he was a patriot pastor. Those 3 factors alone was not something you would find normally among an Anglican minister. And so anyway, the Reverend Charles Clay, they called him. Thomas Jefferson wrote up the bylaws for that church. He donated more money than any of the other people did, any of the other men that founded this church, and they met in the local courthouse there in Charlottesville. And so this is very important. When you read in the back of the book, and by the way, this is something I've just got to totally commend my co-author, Mark Valios. as a longtime pastor in Charlottesville in the early 1990s, the descendants of Charles Clay released the sermon notes, several sermon notes, at least 50 of them from Charles Clay. Mark Belials got those sermon notes, and he took the time to, transcribe at least 2 of them, which we've included both in this book and then also in Doubting Thomas. And you read, this is the gospel presentation that Thomas Jefferson was supporting, and he donated money to this Charles Clay, and he also corresponded with him a lot. And at one point, Charles Clay, later when Jefferson would express, kind of questions about some of the theology, Charles Clay warned him to be a little bit more careful. He said, I know you're being playful in the closet, but somebody might think you're not a Christian, but I know you are. So you want to be careful about this. So anyway, the Jefferson that we think we know is really not the Jefferson of history. And again, he's not the Jefferson that would say, hey, this 10-year-old child wants to say grace at school before he eats his lunch. That's unconstitutional. No, come on. Jefferson would not have agreed with that kind of, anti-Christian nonsense that we've been putting up with, which has often been done in his name.
Let me just mention again that the appendix has those 2 sermons by Reverend Charles Clay, and that's mentioned. And, of course, also when he was in Williamsburg, a lot of our listeners have been to Williamsburg and have seen Bruton Parish Church and talks about that. But there is a whole section here after, of course, the in 1790 and later, in which he's supporting other local clergy. There are donations that he gives to various religious groups. There are religious speeches that he gives, as well as all sorts of things in which he's aligned with some of these Baptist pastors. So, again, this is not the image we have of Thomas Jefferson, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, he was very happy to facilitate and to support and to attend the Christian worship services that were taking place in the U.S. Capitol on Sunday. When Washington, D.C. was created, they talk about the swamp. Washington was built in a swamp, and there weren't a lot of buildings in the early stages, when it became our U.S. Capitol. And so when they made the Capitol building, and before they even finished it, they were having Christian worship services there with his blessing, with his approval. He even he said, hey, you know what, let's have the Marine Band, perform sometimes for these Christian worship services. He attended regularly. His favorite minister that would come, and this is all in the book, was John Glendees, who was a Presbyterian minister and, very Orthodox. So there was a lot of ways in which Jefferson was much more Christian-oriented than we think. And on page 39 of this book, Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty, on page 39, we have in Jefferson's own handwriting.
Yes, you do. That's great.
Yeah, maybe that's a whole little section you wanted to address at a different segment. I'm not sure, but anyway, can I talk about that?
Yeah, we only got a minute left, so let me just promote it, and then we'll come back from the break, because this is a facsimile of course, what is in Thomas Jefferson's own handwriting, the title page of his Bible, which has oftentimes been called the Jefferson Bible, because we do need to cover that, and we will do so. But let me take a break. I just mentioned that, again, as I mentioned before, there are 9 chapters. The first 6 kind of go through Thomas Jefferson's religious life. Then there's a chapter on Christian nationalism, a chapter on secular deism, and some final conclusions. I've already mentioned, of course, the 2 sermons by Reverend Charles Clay, which are really helpful, and then some other material there as well. So if you find yourself saying, well, I would like to know a little bit more about this, I think we've been misled about Thomas Jefferson and his comment about the separation of institutions of church and state have been misused, and they have. And so we'll come back and talk a little bit about that. But what about this Jefferson Bible? I have a copy of that I got when I was at Monticello, and so we'll get into that, as well as some of the doubts he did eventually have about Christian doctrine. We'll get into all that with our good friend Jerry Newcombe right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk with our good friend Dr. Jerry Newcombe, co-author of the book Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty. Let me just mention, as he said just a few minutes ago, that Thomas Jefferson had been in churches, supported churches, went to the U.S. Capitol. That was at one time where church services were held. Later on, he has a picture of the courthouse in Charlottesville, and the previous structure there is where he went to worship as well. But let's come back to this question that people might have, Jerry, about the so-called Jefferson Bible. And on page 39, you have in his handwriting here, the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth goes through what he actually put in the title page of this Jefferson Bible. And that sometimes is cited by secularists to say, well, he didn't really believe in miracles. He didn't believe in the Bible. He really was a Unitarian or a deist or a very secular-minded individual. What about that?
Yeah, here's the facsimile on page 39. This is in Jefferson's own handwriting. The philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, abstracted from the account of his life and doctrines as given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being an abridgment of the New Testament for the use of the Indians, unembarrassed with matters of fact or faith beyond the level of their comprehensions. What Jefferson did after the Louisiana Purchase, when all of a sudden, overnight, hundreds of tribes, many of which had never been reached, with the gospel, hundreds of Indian tribes now became a part of the United States of America. Jefferson, who said on numerous occasions, even in his most skeptical phase, said that the morality of Jesus is the best morality that's ever been introduced to the world. Nothing is ever going to, excel beyond it. And he said he felt that the Indians, and by the way, he supported missions, Christian missions,
yes,
including Catholic missions, to the Indians. And, even at government expense, he did this. And so bottom line is he felt that the Indians would do well to learn what Jesus of Nazareth taught. So, we have it in our whole philosophy. Even the people who reject Christianity, think, hey, love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, that's a pretty good idea, isn't it? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, as Jesus said in Matthew 7:12. For this sums up the law and the prophets. The Indians did not have the benefit of that. And so Jefferson took the time to, with a razor, he cut out certain verses from the Gospels, and he pasted them onto sheets of paper. It was never published, but that was the goal of it. And then he wrote that title page for it. That's what he did. Now, that was the so-called Jefferson Bible. It did include a few miracles, by the way,
Yes.
such as heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons. Now, that was in around 1803 or 1804. We don't even have an exact date, and again, this book was never published. But, it's certainly not in his lifetime. Then jump ahead about 15 years later for his own edification, as he did become, a little bit more questioning in terms of, as I say, the Trinity. That would be probably the single most important doctrine that I think that the later Jefferson had serious questions about. He did the same thing where he used some of the very same verses from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for his own edification, only this time when he made this version, he did it in 4 different columns in 4 different languages: English, and then also Greek, which is what the New Testament is written in, also Latin, and then I believe French, which, he had spent some time in France, so he was familiar with that language. Jefferson poured over the Word of God, at least excerpts of it, as found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I dare say, Kerby, if a child were to bring a copy of the Jefferson Bible into school today and say, "Teacher, can I quote from this?" Because of the ACLU type mentality we've had, this freedom from religion. Oh, you can't mention the Bible, in the public schools, even though the Bible was the reason that there is education for the masses in the first place in the American experience, as we know, but that, anyway, you can't do that. That violates church and state, separation of church and state. And so the Jefferson Bible, even as it is, in other words, you say you bought a copy at Monticello. Mark Belials, my co-author in this book, said that it really wasn't until the early 20th century, so 100 years after Jefferson's death, he died in 1826, the Unitarians printed the so-called Jefferson Bible. Basically what it is
yes,
the morality of Jesus as found in these select Bible verses from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, but it gives you the idea that, oh yeah, Jefferson wanted to, remove the Bible or remove the miracles and so forth. No, Jefferson wanted the Indians to be, acquainted and to learn about what Jesus said. And so, in the meantime, he did have the Bible, and he used the Bible, and there's all kinds of different quotes that we have from his writings where he loved this particular verse and he loved that particular verse and so forth, Psalm 15 and so forth.
One other thing I think I might just mention, we think that today elections are contentious. How about the election of 1800? Because you talk about in one of your chapters about secular deism and Jefferson's distorted religious legacy. That's when you start getting some of the attacks on Thomas Jefferson. And, of course, I think our good friend Daniel Dreisbach and Philip Hamburger and yourself and others have clarified that. But during that election, there was such an attack on his faith, and it was such a contentious election that there were people, I think at a time, were even burying their Bibles because they afraid of some of the fact. And again, this was a deliberate political propaganda, which we unfortunately have inherited today here in the 21st century, haven't we?
Yes, that is a fascinating point, and the fears that some of the New Englanders had that he would, he would take away people's Bibles and so forth, were totally unfounded. In fact, if you read some of the animosity that Jefferson does have towards people, professing Christians in some context, you could see what it really boils down to is he did not appreciate established religion. Jefferson was absolutely in favor of the idea not only of separation of church and state in terms of the institution of the church from the institution of the state, but he did not like the idea of established religion. He felt that that was a violation of the principles of Jesus. In fact, he even argues that in his famous, the document that's called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which he wrote in 1777, and it was adopted in 1786. And he says, look, it's a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, chose reason and not coercion as the means to propagate faith in him. In other words, Jesus Christ didn't force himself on us. Therefore, the state shouldn't force somebody to believe something they don't believe. So he did have animosity. You could see it sometimes where he got upset with some religious groups. And I do think the acrimony of the 1800 election between, him and then, the Federalists, he often uses the phrase, the Northern preachers. And here he's talking mostly, people from New England. Now, I've got to say something. This is really a weird fact of history. It's just kind of crazy. But in the 1800 election, Thomas Jefferson handily beat the Federalist candidate, who was John Adams.
Right.
So John Adams lost re-election, and he lost big time. But there was a third candidate, and that was Aaron Burr. And back then, it wasn't that you would have the president and the vice president would be on the same ticket. The vice president would be the second candidate got the second amount of votes. So Aaron Burr did become Thomas Jefferson's vice president. But what was amazing was that what happened in Broward County with Al Gore and George W. Bush was nothing compared to what happened in that 1800 election where Jefferson, by one vote only, after 36, I believe we've got it in the book. I think it was 36. I forgot the exact number. But anyway, day after day, they would ballot, and day after day, Thomas Jefferson got X number of votes, and Aaron Burr got the exact same number until one man changed his vote, and then Thomas Jefferson became our third president. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
Anyway, bottom line is the acrimony of that 1800 election was just awful, and it did put a bad taste in his mouth, and made some people think, oh, Jefferson's maybe an unbeliever.
Well, let's take a break. We have one more segment. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes. Again, Jerry Newcombe is the co-author of this book, Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty. If you'd like to share this with an individual, you can go to pointofview.net, click on the button that says share, let some people know about this interview or about this book. Click on the button that says learn more, and that's where you can get, if you would like to get a paperback edition or it on Kindle, that is available. And so again, lots of resources. Might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but most likely I think this is the way to get it. And Jerry, we've talked about all sorts of different aspects of this, but one that I think we've missed mentioning is when he was talking about Christianity on more than one occasion, didn't Thomas Jefferson identify himself as a Christian?
Yes, he did. He called himself a Christian, and so he never called himself a deist. And by the way, a deist, even in Jefferson's most skeptical phase of life, which would be, he'd be more of a Unitarian, but he was never a deist. A deist is somebody who believes that there is a God, but he's kind of the first mover in the universe. It's as if he made the world and he just kind of has left it to its own devices or whatever. A deist would not believe in praying to God because there's no point. There's not a God that would answer prayer. Jefferson was not in that, persuasion. And Jefferson, by all outward, appearances, while he had some private doubts again about the Trinity, he was a professing Christian. By the way, this is an interesting thing. We said this in both books, Doubting Thomas and in the Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty, that Jefferson was, even at his worst, he was heterodoxic, but orthodoxic, or orthopraxic rather. In other words, his his theology got a little whack near the end from critiquing him from a biblical Christian perspective. Okay, but he was practicing as an outward professing Christian. So, for example, when the Episcopal Church reopened in 2009, in 1819, okay, in Charlottesville. So, in other words, he'd been supporting churches, evangelical churches, Christian churches, in the area, sending them money, participating, going to worship services, etc. But then, when the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, made itself available, Christ Church opened up in Charlottesville in 1819. So for the last few years or several years of his life, he would go to church there. And the policy was, just like in Bruton Parish Church that you mentioned in Colonial Williamsburg, those Anglican churches in those days had something on the handwriting on the wall, which was it was called a reredos, and it would have the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. And the congregation would stand up, and together they would read, for example, the Apostles' Creed. Well, the Apostles' Creed, basically says, I believe in God the Father, I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, I believe in the Holy Ghost. And so, that's the Trinity right there. But Jefferson participated in that. He did, so outwardly you would have thought he was, that he believed all that stuff. And privately in some of his correspondence, he seemed to just question some of the finer details about that. Also, he made arrangements before he died. He said he wanted to make sure that the local, his priest there at the Anglican Church would say the funeral service, in the traditional Christian perspective, from the Anglican. So that would include verses like the statement from Jesus in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me shall live even though he dies. So the idea that Jefferson was some sort of skeptic, like, let's say, in the mode of Thomas Paine, who did later lose his faith, wrote The Age of Reason, which is a very anti-Christian screed. But even, by the way, even earlier in his life with Thomas Paine, when he was of importance to the American cause, and he wrote Common Sense. Common Sense appeals to the Bible and is quotes. Now, it doesn't quote directly from the Bible, but it makes biblical allusions and references to Gideon and Samuel and so forth. And he's making the point about kings and what a difference, kings can bring, wreak havoc, like the royal brute of Britain, So anyway, what's happened is it's as if some of these founding fathers are rewritten as if they're secularists. They even did that with George Washington, which they never had a leg to stand on with that, as far as historical, accuracy is concerned. At least with Thomas Jefferson, you can find some statements he makes against some aspects of Christianity. But again, if you look and read between the lines, you realize, okay, what he's opposing here are ministers trying to force, a kind of a theocracy, if you will, on, or they're basically saying, we're going to establish a denomination in this particular territory. Even when he wrote that letter to the Danbury Baptists, the reason the Danbury Baptists even reached out to him, they were living in the state of Connecticut. And in the state of Connecticut, at the time that they wrote to him, even though they helped, with the revolution and everything, as Baptists, they were minorities in a state that had a state-run denomination, the denomination of the Congregationalists.
So again, just incredible stories there. And of course, in the chapter on Christian nationalism, you even talk about the fact that these ideas of the laws of nature, nature's God. Of course, we've quoted in the past Gary Amos, and I have that even in my booklet on the Declaration, John Locke, William Blackstone, and others. These are ideas that he actually incorporated into the Declaration. He was saying at the time, I'm not creating anything new. In some respects, he's pulling all that together. And the incredible intellect and the opportunity of having again, this celebration of the Declaration of Independence. I just thought it was great that you have put this book together in a way that's quite readable. And again, it is available on our website. And of course, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore. And Jerry, of course, people can go to Providence Forum. We have that link as well. Thanks so highly of what you do there and what Peter Lillback does. So as always, it's just a delight to have you on the program. And thank you for educating us again about America's history.
Oh, well, thank you for the privilege to do that. And if I could say one last little thing, at providenceforum.org, we have links to these videos that I've made. And by God's grace, I was able to get Mike Huckabee to do the voice for me of the historic readings that I have of quotes from Thomas Jefferson. And I got Michael Medved to do the voice of John Adams. And I got Alan West to even do the voice of Thomas Paine and so forth. So anyway, I'm very pleased with how that whole series turned out. We have Peter Lillback and Bill Federer and Eric Metaxas and Oz Guinness and Dennis Prager and Alveda King and all these different people commenting in these 7 films that show, hey, America began on a Judeo-Christian foundation, and that is the source of our liberties. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction in that these liberties are the gift of God?
Very good.
That's what Jefferson said. That's what we're talking about in the title even of this book.
Well, again, we're just out of time, so let me first of all thank Megan for engineering the program. That'd be Megan Kitchen, by the way, and Steve and Doug in the background, and we will look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There are so many big stories happening literally everywhere. So much information, documents released, grand jury testimony, political accusations and claims on all sides. How in the world can any of us keep up? How do we weed out the truly important from the merely sensational? None of us can do it alone. I've been in media for more than 45 years. I've trained my skills, and yet even with that, I am glad for the more than 50-year track record of the team here at Point of View. They help us to cut through the noise and focus on the authentically important. More than that, biblically informed eyes to help us understand and develop ways to respond effectively. Providing what we need takes time and resources, and your partnership makes it all possible. Click on into pointofview.net, hit the donate button, or call 1-800-347-5151. Please give today. Better, sign up and help monthly. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.